Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm also crucially aware that I stand between you and lunch, and I will try to get my points across as quickly as I can. So, this Oxford Farming Conference, what will in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time people think were the important things that were happening now? We've got a huge number of different and fascinating dimensions of farming are being covered, but if you were writing the history of British farming in 2040, 2050, what would be true of this time? What would be the really salient matters that changed or altered your prospects and against which you may succeed or not? Now, there are many, of which technology is obviously going to be a very large part. But I would put it to you that there are two things which come together now, which are really quite sharp discontinuities or breaks with the past. And both of them, in the context of that technology, come from the policy or the politics side. Now, I'm an economist, not a politician, and I don't wish to opine on the politics in terms of right or wrong. But there are two crucial bits. The first is, and it's been brewing for some time, the understanding and translation into practical policy of the idea that we can't go on depleting our natural capital and our natural environment and allow the environment to continue to depreciate. And the second one is Brexit. And these come about for completely separate reasons, but they turn out to have a very, very sharp and important intersection. Brexit, whether you're in favour of it or against, means the end of the common agricultural policy, and farming covers 70–80% of our land, so the achievement of the environmental objectives can only be done within the context of a farming framework and farming policy. And these two confluences come from the turn towards more environmental concern, which goes back to 2010, David Cameron as Prime Minister, and 2011, the white paper, which I'll comment on in a moment, but which aimed to put the environment at the heart of the economy and set the objective to leave the natural environment in a better state for the next generation than it was inherited. And I should stress, it's going downhill, and we're measuring it quite carefully and quite accurately now, so that is a very tall, substantive ask to be put in place. And in the next couple of weeks or so, hopefully, we will see the 25-year environmental plan, which is intended to be the overarching framework for achieving that long-term objective, and within which agricultural policy will be set, as the Secretary of State pointed out this morning. And that's a very sharp discontinuity between himself and his predecessor. His predecessor thought there would be an agricultural farming policy, 25-year plan, and an environmental policy next to each other. What Michael Gove has correctly, in my view, done is put the overarching 25-year environment plan at the head and put the other components within that framework. So what I'd like to do in the brief time I have is first of all explain why natural capital is an important framework to think about farming, to think about the environment more generally, and to think about public policy, what it is, why we need a 25-year plan, and then a bit about what the plan should contain. And then I want to turn to how this relates to farming and how farming will be supported possibly after Brexit. So natural capital is sort of new or novel idea to quite a lot of people, particularly industry, services, etc. But it should be absolutely straightforward to farmers. Farming is about deploying natural capital with all the ingenuity and other inputs that farmers bring to their land to produce outputs. It's what nature gave us for free. It's what the entire world's economy depends upon. And its use its maintenance, and its management are what farmers do every day. And so the concepts here are about balance sheets, they're about asset registers, they're about assets in perpetuity. These assets can't be allowed to depreciate. These are renewable natural capital assets, like soils and so on, so they need to be treated on a current cost basis. Capital maintenance is the guts of maintaining that natural capital and therefore farming capital intact. And there are enhancements to make which add to that capital stock and to the maintenance that goes with it. So if you take a standard set of farm accounts, that's the basis to start and the balance sheet of the farm to design an understanding of the natural capital that farmers control, handle, and do so, not just for themselves, but for that land for future generations too. It's absolutely essential to economic growth. Without a natural environment, there is no economy. Without water, land, soils, air, climate, oceans, forests, etc., there is no economy at all. We cannot sustain 1 billion people without those things, let alone 9 billion, 10 billion, and perhaps more people. So the depletion of those assets in a serious current cost sense is a depletion of the future opportunities and prospects for future generations. We can do much better with those assets. We've enhanced a lot of those assets. That's what farmers do in developing their businesses. And of course, we have a wonderful opportunity now to bring the environment and the economy together through the enormous technical change, which is one of the core features of our time. And that's not just about understanding about what happens on the farm with respect to the crop, for example. We now know a great deal more about nature, what helps nature, what damages nature, what environmental schemes work, what don't, etc. So for all the application of drones and robotics and so on, and the digitalization of the farming practice, that's also extremely relevant to understanding our natural environment. Now, the 25-year plan was our idea in the Natural Capital Committee, and it's a way of translating the overall objective in the 2011 white paper, The Natural Choice, of being the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than inherited, into practical action. Because government's quite good at having big objectives. Who isn't in favour as a politician of sustainability? Who doesn't want to leave the environment in a better state? It's not easy to find anyone who won't sign up to such broad objectives. But they're pretty meaningless unless they have substance. And so we took the view that generation's about 25 years' time, so therefore what needed to be done was to spell out how the natural environment would be changed and improved and protected in that timescale. And that doesn't mean that all natural capital should be protected. Farming has been largely in its history about pushing nature in certain directions, modifying nature, and we'll go on doing that. But the aggregate, the total value of the natural capital, can't be allowed to go down to achieve the objective. That means there must be compensation for losses, as well as benefits that come on the gain side. As I mentioned before, capital maintenance is of the absolute essence, and this has to be embedded within the framework of accounting and accounting framework. Now, we were asked, there's a Natural Capital Committee, Michael Gove wrote to me in the summer of now last year, asking the committee to give formal advice on what the 25-year plan should contain. And we produced that advice, and being an independent committee, of course, we made sure it was published too. And we had at the core, this is not a particularly good designed slide, but we had at the core, first of all, being absolutely clear what it is you want to achieve in 25 years' time, so what that prize looks like, being very clear about the milestones to achieve that prize in 25 years' time, beginning to specify precisely what sort of investment should be made, and we were very clear it needs governance, and in particular an act of Parliament to embed it, and so it doesn't just become another political broad ambition without delivery. And we set out how this might impact on different parts of the environment. We have been instrumental, and again, it was our idea in the committee, in setting up the pilots, river catchments, urban areas. Of course, that's where nearly everyone lives, and therefore it's the crucial bit of environment next to people, marine areas and landscape areas, and of course, agriculture fits very much within that frame. So we now have, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, a 25-year plan. It may or may not live up to the advice that my committee has provided, but it's the starting gun to now get on with it and deliver practically the broad objectives set out in 210. But this has to be done in the context of what wasn't anticipated by David Cameron, Caroline Spellman, and the other 3 or 4 Secretaries of State that we've had since then. I'm on number 5 now. Wasn't anticipated that into this would be pushed the maelstrom of Brexit. And as you all know, Brexit impinges on agriculture almost more than any other sector of the economy. So I want to just tie up the 25-year plan with the aspects of agriculture which encourage governments to intervene in the way that they don't do in other sectors of the economy. And I want to contextualise this because it's very, very important that we are all realistic about the role of agriculture in the national negotiations for the future of the British economy in the framework of post-Brexit world. Agriculture's output is 9 billion, roughly. That is about 0.7% of GDP. It's not 1% of GDP. The cap subsidies are 3 billion. The sector has other advantages and implicit subsidies. It has a special inheritance tax deal. It has a special red diesel deal. It has a special business rates arrangement. It does not pay for the pollution that it causes in the way that other sectors are forced to do. And it does not pay for the consequences to the wider environment of some of its activities. None of that is criticism. None of that is to say that any of those things are right or wrong. It's simply to recognise that whereas 100 years ago, agriculture was where economies were at in the West, they are now extremely small, here at least in Britain, and given the scale of the subsidies, the actual economic significance net of subsidies is very, very small indeed. It's not a criticism, it's just a fact. Of course, there's a big food and drinks industry, but many countries have food and drinks industries without a large, sometimes with a small, agricultural sector. But the core, what's at stake when it comes to the average voter in the average urban area for agriculture in economic terms is relatively trivial compared with what's at stake for the City of London, for the services, which are nearly 80% of the economy, for the 15 to 20% of manufacturing industry. The 0.7 doesn't stand very large. Now, none of that's to say that farming isn't significant for lots of other reasons, but its scale is quite small. So what I want to do is just quickly zip through these 4 areas: trade, land values, and Pillar 1, public goods for public money, and the pollution and the polluter pays principle. Now, on trade, and the Secretary of State has covered a lot of this territory, and we've had good discussion already today. So, because agriculture is small, it's a very small part of any new trade negotiation. And there's every chance that other sectors will count more, and trade negotiations always have trade-offs. You win some and you lose some. So when it comes to a trade agreement with, say, the United States, it will be interesting to see where the interests of British farmers stand against those of American farmers, compared with the interests of financial institutions and other bodies. It's also the case that the US and the EU are part of an extremely protectionist world. We describe our world as free trade and we want all this free globalization, etc. But actually, particularly in agriculture, it's still a very protectionist framework. And for many of you in this room, for our farming industry, the market that really counts, and without it, there will be very substantial damage to the agricultural sector, is the EU. So we have to be clear what it is we want. The Secretary of State talks of a free trade agreement with Europe, perhaps. But if not, then people need to think very hard what WTO rules really mean, how you do border adjustments for standards, for animal welfare and so on, and how exactly these common standards are to be enforced. For me, the trade negotiations are the most important component of post-Brexit agriculture in Britain and should demand most of the attention of what goes forward. Now then there's Pillar 1 and Pillar 1 subsidies and the payments. The Secretary of State has made a number of remarks about who gets this money and what the implications might be. I want to make one point, which actually the Secretary of State made two, which was discussed and lambasted in the august pages of the Farmers Weekly, which I read on a regular basis. It is that if you pay people for the ownership of land, the capital value of that land will go up. There may be many other reasons why it goes up and many other reasons why it goes down. But if you take away the Pillar 1 payments, other things being equal, land values will fall. And that will be painful for those people whose finances are tied to the capital value of the land and those people who own those assets. It can't be otherwise. Higher land prices mean lower financial yields, and by definition, they're a barrier to entry. That's why the EU, laughably, has to set aside money in the CAP to help young farmers get into farming because its policy has driven up the land prices which they can't afford to come in. That's quite extraordinary, but it's one of the many features of a policy which was designed for the benefits of French and German farmers after the Second World War, or French farmers at the expense of German farmers whose manufacturing would have access to markets. Now you can abolish Pillar 1. I think that's inevitably going to happen. You can take a transitionary period to get rid of it. I think that's inevitably going to happen too. But nobody's talking about the capitalised losses that may be incurred, and maybe the readers and the authors in Farmers Weekly are correct, and there is no capitalisation effects, and the laws of economics have been abandoned, but I don't think that's true. So, third is public monies for public goods. What people should focus on is the idea that we're providing public money for private goods at the moment. And that no sector of the economy should be entitled to. Of course, what public goods means, what we, the public, get from taxpayers' money put to this sector rather than the coal miners, the steel workers, the shipyard workers, the bankers who might find themselves inconvenienced by Brexit, all the other sectors of the economy which are much more important in the economy. Okay? What we mean by public goods needs definition. And of course, it's not just pure environmental things. It's not just bees and birds and so on. The Secretary of State referred to many of the other dimensions as to why we intervene, including technology, R&D, research, rural communities and so on. But that's what people need to focus on. What is it exactly we as a society should expect from you, which we're prepared to pay you to do, which you wouldn't otherwise do? And there are various ways of doing that. I personally wouldn't try to adapt Pillar 2. I think it's pretty hopelessly designed, but other people may take a different view. And it's also open, of course, to other players in our rural environment, in our environment more generally, to come in and bid for that money alongside the existing farmers. The fourth and final area is on pollution and the polluter pays principle. It is a really quite extraordinary distinction between farming and, say, the chemical industry, the power sector, or whatever. That in all the other sectors of the economy, it's broadly accepted that if you cause pollution by your activities, you will pay the costs. And we're now discussing producer responsibility extended to plastic waste, for example. But carbon, etc., is taxed. We have a general approach which says the polluter is responsible for pollution and should compensate for the damage they're caused, except in farming, where the notion is that if you want me to not pollute the environment, if you want me to control effluents and so on from my land, you ought to pay me not to do it. You ought to pay me not to take the hedgerows out. You ought to pay me not to do certain things. And where we have stopped people doing these things, we've used regulation rather than charges. Now, of course, there are good reasons why that's the case, and farming has established itself in the way it has. But my view would be that gradually this idea of immunity from the polluter pays principle will get eroded through time. Which brings me to the future of farming. And this is the area where I think there are lots of reasons to be extremely cheerful. It's not just the huge opportunities that are provided by the new technologies, which we've heard about in the last session and throughout the conference. But it is the turning point where we have the end of what I regard as a disastrous CAP in sight. It has not, in my view, served the environment well. I don't think in the long run it's actually served farmers well, and our natural capital in the farming area is not what it should be. After Brexit, and in a more sustained subsidy world, which reflects the public goods for which public money should be paid, land values will normalise to reflect yields. When I look at an Exmoor farm, which I actually was considering buying, the idea that I would pay £5,000 an acre for top, high elevation, not particularly good condition, upland farmland for a yield which couldn't possibly be £500 per acre, it's absurd. And if you look at prime agricultural land, £10,000, £12,000 an acre against the yields. This isn't normal economics. This is the world of what subsidies deliver. Now, farmers will be paid properly to deliver the public goods that are required, and they'll be able to offer what they can and use their knowledge and their understanding of their management of the land to deliver those things. Markets will determine prices, like we expect in any other part of the economy, and hopefully, eventually, we'll get rid of the trade distortions. So there are enormous benefits in these two big shifts: the move towards taking the environment seriously in the 25-year plan and Brexit, whatever the other downsides of Brexit might be, and I'm sure there'll be many. That benefits the public, they get a better deal for their public money, to farmers who get a more sustainable framework in which to operate, to the restoration of our natural capital, and therefore to the economy. Thank you very much indeed.